Hey there, Fletcher from All Things Overlanding here, and today I'm going to be talking about what happens when something goes wrong with your build, with a modification, with a DIY thing that you're doing. I feel like nobody ever talks about that, right? Everybody on YouTube shows these videos of like their installs going great and they never make any mistakes. It's easy when you're editing stuff after the fact to make it look like you're an expert and you know exactly what you're doing. But I want to kind of buck that narrative a little bit and say things do go wrong, right? There are times when I make mistakes. I'm, a car guy and I've been for quite a few years, but like my parents weren't at all. It's not like I grew up in a mechanic shop. Like I've just taught myself everything I know from YouTube, right? So today I wanted to talk a little bit about, how things can go wrong, and then also talk a little bit about how I've had things go wrong in the past and how I've worked to address them, right? So today's episode is going to be about that. It's going to be about when things go wrong, how they go wrong, and then how to kind of avoid that as much as possible, and some tips and tricks to make your installs or do-it-yourself modifications in the future smoother and better with less chance of mistakes. So if you want to learn more about how to avoid errors and how to reduce the number of mistakes you make when doing car stuff or vehicle modifications or gear modifications or do-it-yourself additions to your vehicle, stay tuned.
You got it, I got it. It began in the land of the sandstorm. I fought it, though I wanted everything to do with what you give to me. Loosening my grip.
All right, guys, so as I mentioned in the intro, today's episode is talking about when things go wrong, how they can go wrong, and I'm talking about related to like vehicle modifications or do-it-yourself gear things, or even just like ideas for gear that you've had, like my unistrut roof rack that I made, for example, or I did a DIY rooftop tent a while ago. That kind of thing. What happens when you run into problems? How do you get around those? How do you avoid those problems in the first place, right? So I'm going to kind of start by talking about some of the things that I've experienced in my past and things that I've learned from, and then I'm going to move on to sort of tips and tricks to reduce the likelihood of that. And then I'm going to finish with kind of like, what do you do when it happens? Because as much as we try to avoid it, there's always going to be something that's going to go wrong with an installation of a new piece of gear, a bumper, a bed rack, whatever the case may be. There's going to be problems with it. And how do you kind of come back from that, right? Like, how do you make the best of a bad situation? So let's start out by talking a little bit about some experiences that I've had in the past where I had maybe not the best experience, right? So, and again, anything that I say about any of these things that I installed, in almost every single case, it didn't have anything to do with the manufacturer or their instructions. It's my own fault, right? People make mistakes, especially people, like I said, like me, I'm a guy, I skim directions, I don't read directions, which is problematic, and we'll talk about that more later in the episode. But like, it's very easy if you're in a hurry or if you're on a time constraint or if you have a buddy that's available to help you for a short period of time and then they have to leave, to kind of skip some things in the instructions and to cause problems for yourself. So when I'm talking about any of these things that I'm going to talk about in this episode, it's by no means throwing any shade on any of the manufacturers of these products or anything like that. And in a lot of cases, they're things that I did as a DIY thing that no one manufactured. I just was trying to figure it out and maybe it didn't work out, right? So again, no shade on any of these companies whatsoever, but just kind of talking about things that I've experienced, how they went wrong, and then what you can do to avoid them. So let's start out by talking about an easy one, right? My unistrut roof rack that I talked about. That was an idea that I had after I watched a couple of YouTube videos. I think Donald from Soft-Roading the West was one of the early ones that I watched. It was a really good video where I'm like, man, he has this cool Subaru and he built this cool do-it-yourself unistrut, very simple sort of roof rack that you could attach rotopacks to and a shovel and just like very easy stuff, right? Unistrut is fantastic stuff and you can do a ton of cool things with it. And at the time I had a Nissan Xterra, which is not a popular vehicle in the modification world. There aren't a lot of roof rack options, and the ones that they do have are very expensive and kind of cost prohibitive. So at that time I was like, you know what, I'm gonna do this do-it-yourself unistrut thing. But I didn't really know what I was doing, right? I watched a few videos on YouTube. I went out, I spent about $100 on unistrut stuff. I came home and I started cutting it up. Now I made about a 30-minute video. It's a very old video, so apologies. It has a lot of talking. It has a lot of downtime, but it has quite a few views on it, and I think it's helped quite a few people, so I'm glad that it was helpful, even though it was one of my earlier releases and not the most high quality, condensed, helpful video I've ever made. But I will link to that in the description down below, or throw a card up here if you're on YouTube, if you want to go check it out, or if you just want some ideas for how you might be able to make something like a do-it-yourself roof rack. The unistrut stuff was really cool. And there's tons of ways you could use unistrut. You could use it on the inside of your vehicle to build shelves or racks, like that kind of thing. There's a ton of ways to use it. But when I was doing that, I learned a lot of stuff. I learned about cutting metal. I learned about attaching metal together via bolts. I learned about the unistrut system itself and kind of how that channel system sort of works. And I had to figure some stuff out. But there were definitely challenges. I did some things wrong too. I unboxed the end of the unistrut and made it flat so that I could more easily mount it. But then that removed all the structure from the unistrut, which weakened it, right? It made it not as strong. Now, at the time, I didn't realize that. I learned stuff from the comments. I learned from watching additional videos. And, we all kind of learned together that way. But, again, in that situation, that was kind of what I learned. I learned that unistrut is really cool. There are definitely some limitations to it. And you've got to be careful when you're changing the design of something that you bought with one intended use for another, because you may introduce weaknesses or failure points, right? Now, again, I'm going to avoid going into those things specifically, like the things that I weakened and the ways that I screwed that up. I'm going to save that for the kind of like how to avoid those things here in a second. So just keep that in mind. Unistrut was one of those examples. Another one is the Xtrusion Overland rack that I've got. It's an amazing rack. It's super flexible. There's a ton of ways you can put it together. But one of the downsides of that, especially for someone like me that's kind of like, I don't know what I'm doing, right, is I put that thing together 2 or 3 times and it was incorrect every time. Luckily, again, though, the Xtrusion guys are awesome. They saw me at an expo and they're like, bro, that's totally wrong, but we can come over with some tools and we'll help you fix it. And they came over at the expo and we actually took it apart and put it back together and they helped me fix it. So again, in that case, they have worked. I've had my Xtrusion rack for probably 2 or 3 years now. They've worked on their end because they saw that and they went, wow, these people are dumb, right? Myself being the one I'm talking about here. But they've worked to make the instructions better. They've built like some software, some apps that will help you put the rack together and simplify the installation, because it is kind of like Lincoln Logs, but out of aluminum, right? Like there's so many ways to put this thing together. You get a box full of Xtrusion pieces and a bunch of hardware, and you kind of just have to figure it out. So, again, they were awesome. They were super helpful with it. And after a couple of tries, I got it together. It worked fine. It was safe the other ways that I had it. It just wasn't the desired way that it was supposed to be put together per the way that they had built it for me. So, those things happen as well. And then more recently, I got a bumper from Z1 Off-Road. It's an awesome bumper. And they had really clear instructions. But again, I was in a rush. I had a buddy come over to help me with it. He was only able to help for a couple hours. We had to get the thing on the truck. I glanced at the instructions for it. I glanced at the imagery for it, and I put it in the wrong bolt holes. And if you actually read the note that's right by that picture, it says, hey, these bolt holes are for trucks with a 2-inch body lift. If you're a stock truck, use the other holes. I didn't catch that note, so I put them in the wrong holes, and then I ended up basically trimming my bumper too much for my bumper cover, the plastic bumper cover, too much for the steel bumper itself. Again, it was clear, it was in the instructions. It's my own fault for not reading them. Once again, I hit up the Z1 guys. They were awesome, super helpful. They did everything they could to try and help me out with it, and I made the best of it that I could, right? But things like that happen, and no one's perfect. So those are a few examples. Now I'm going to take those examples. We're going to move into part 2 of this episode. I'm going to talk a little bit about some tips and tricks, some things that I've learned to avoid issues like that and to prevent yourself from making those mistakes in the first place, because that's the ideal state, right? Screwing up is going to happen. It is inevitable to some degree, but the more that you can prevent it, the better off you're going to be in the long run. And a lot of that has to do with, I would say, personality flaws within myself, which are, being impatient, just trying to rush through things, trying to get things done. I'm excited about the end result, but I don't oftentimes take enough time to really look through all the instructions, read everything really carefully, lay out the stuff to make sure I have all the components, right? So let's talk now about that kind of stuff, right? How do you avoid causing these problems? So in the example of the unistrut stuff, I watched a few videos. I saw how they put it together. I went out and I bought unistrut, and then I completely forgot about all those videos, and I was just like, how am I going to do it, right? How am I going to make it cooler and better and different? And I started to build the rack. And again, it came out great. It's still on my second gen Frontier. It was on my Xterra before that. It's held an awning and a rooftop tent. It solved a ton of problems, and it's held up fine. It's galvanized metal. I don't really have any rust on it. I have a little bit of corrosion, but nothing too bad. It's still strong, and it still works fine. So despite the weaknesses that I introduced into it, like unboxing the end of the unistrut to make it easier to attach, to avoid the channel problem, which involves like channel nuts and then bolts that go down through that, it's still been fine. So it's very seldom that when you make a mistake or you do something like this, focus that it's going to be the end of the road, or it's going to be a complete redo, or it's going to totally screw up your vehicle, right? A lot of people are very afraid to make any modifications to a vehicle because they're afraid they're going to do something that is irreversible, and that's very seldom the case. Obviously, if you poured, water into where your oil should go, that would be bad, and that would be a very serious problem. So I'm not saying you can't screw anything up, but in a lot of cases, adding something like an aftermarket bumper or an aftermarket roof rack or something like that is not going to totally, just destroy your vehicle. So one, don't be so afraid of it, but at the same time, be extremely cautious, right? Like I kind of mentioned earlier, some ways to avoid these problems is before you start on a thing. So let's say you order a thing like the Xtrusion bedrack or the Z1 bumper, right? When you order those things and you get them, first things first, they're going to give you like a checklist of all the items you should have received. Lay all those items out, confirm that you have everything, because if you start on it and then you find out you're short a bolt or you're short a nut or something, it's going to be way harder to kind of come back from that when it's partially assembled. Then you got to do extra work to take it off, or you got to deal with the truck being partially apart. If it's your daily driver, that can cause problems for you, right? So just make sure that you have all the components. Double check, triple check everything. Make sure that you've got it. Lay it out in a clear and concise way. Confirm which bolts are which. In a lot of these installations, you're going to have different length bolts. You're going to have different size bolts. You're going to have different thread pitch on your bolts. Confirm which ones are which. Don't just guess. Again, lay everything out. Make sure that you've got all the components. That's step one. Step two, when you have instructions, read through them extremely carefully. If you run into problems, most of these manufacturers, if not all of them, are amazing to work with. Z1 is a great example. Xtrusion is a great example, right? If I had questions about that stuff beforehand and reached out before I had caused the problem for myself, I wouldn't even have gotten so far that I had the problem, right? If I'd reached out to Xtrusion in the first place when I was like, I don't know if this is right, they could have, and I'm sure would have, hopped on a FaceTime call with me or sent me some sort of a manual or looked at my, the way that I had it laid out and been like, nope, this goes here, that goes there, and they could have helped me fix it from the get-go so that the first time I installed the bed rack, it worked perfectly. So again, stop. Make sure you have all the components. Check through the instructions really closely. If you have questions, reach out to the manufacturer or the distributor before you start to assemble it, before you put yourself in a situation where you've got to make some tough decisions and you potentially cause more problems for yourself than you would if you just did the pre-research in the first place. Another tip, so outside of the manufacturers and their instructions, is YouTube is great, but again, you got to take everything with a grain of salt. So you can't just watch one video and then be like, I'm an expert now and I understand this. Watch as many videos as you can, read as many forum posts as you can, ask questions in Facebook groups. Make sure that you've got a really good understanding of what you're about to start on project-wise before you start with it. So those are sort of my tips for how to avoid the problems in the first place, right? Take your time, measure twice, cut once, read the instructions really carefully, make sure you've got all the components, reach out to the manufacturer if you have questions, ask people on forums, ask around, and make sure you've got a really firm grasp on exactly what you're doing all the way through the project, not just the first two steps. Before you get into it, make sure that you know what you're going to do and that you've got everything in a good place and you're ready to move forward. So then third, right, when you mess things up, which again, despite your best efforts, it's going to happen sometimes, right? The Xtrusion rack is the perfect example of this, where like I put it all together and I'm like, I think it's right, and I threw it on the truck. And then I was like, I think I sent a picture or something to Xtrusion. I was like, does this look right? And they're like, no, it doesn't. This needs to go there and this needs to go there. And then I was like, okay, now I got it. And then I took some pieces apart and I moved some things around, put it back together, and I was like, that's it. And I'm like, but why do I have this extra bar, right? And then again, finally, I met up with them at an expo and I brought all the components and they helped me fix it. But so when that happens, right, what you can do though is you can always minimize the trouble by slowing down, stepping back, asking questions early. If you're going to make some sort of a change to your truck, like cutting a bumper or like installing a bed rack, and especially if you're going to be installing a bunch of gear on it and stuff like that that's weight and could be potentially dangerous. Same with the unistrut roof rack. If you're worried about that weight stuff, do some more testing, do some more question asking, check everything out, and make sure that you feel good about it, right? There's never too many questions that you can ask. There's never, before you do anything that's going to be a permanent change to your vehicle, just take a step back, ask around, ask some questions, ask other people that have done the install of the Xtrusion rack, of the unistrut. Go around to the forums and post up pictures and ask people. Now you may get some bullying, you may get some, hey, you're an idiot. I'm probably going to get it from this video because of talking about the stuff that I've screwed up, right? But I mean, it happens. I'm not embarrassed about it. I don't care about it. And if you think that's funny, then good. That means you're a bad person. That's fine. I'm not going to make fun of anybody either. If you have questions about unistrut stuff, go on that unistrut video and drop a question, and I will do everything I can to answer you, even though it's been a few years since I built that thing. If you have questions about an Xtrusion bed rack, go into the Xtrusion Overland bed rack community. There's a whole group for it, and people ask questions and post up pictures, and most of those people know what they're doing. They've recently installed those bedracks themselves. The people that run the company are in that group. They will happily come in there and help you, right? There are a ton of ways to make the best of it. Before you do anything that could be detrimental to your vehicle, just pause for a minute, take a step back, ask a lot of questions, right? So those are kind of my tips. Those are the things that I've learned over the last few years, and I'm still definitely not perfect. Do not feel like it's the end of the world. You can redo the bed rack. It may be extra work, right? Again, if you had taken the time in the first place, if you'd really done the research, if you made sure you had the components, if you'd asked those questions, then you don't have to go back and do the rework. If you get to that point though, doing the rework is okay. It just means you're gonna have to spend some more time to make it right. But don't be lazy. Don't take the easy way out. Try and do it the best way that you possibly can and keep it as clean as possible. And in the end, you'll have a good result. All right, so that will do it for this episode. Again, I hope that that's helpful. I hope that maybe that makes some of you feel better. Again, if you've screwed something up, I know I've felt stressed about my extrusion rack for a long time. I felt stressed about the bumper stuff. I felt stressed about the unistrut roof rack. Like, I was so worried about this stuff, and now I've run that unistrut roof rack for like 5 years on 2 different vehicles, and it's been fine. And I've run the extrusion rack, and now that it's put together, it's been amazing. It's awesome. It's aluminum. It doesn't rust. It's so flexible, and there's so many ways to do it. The Z1 bumper I used, and I tapped a tree last weekend. If I hadn't had that, I would have wrecked the side of my truck, but the Z1 bumper protected it. So, like, again, these things are worth it. It's worth the effort to make changes to your vehicle. I think it's worth the time and the exercise of committing yourself to doing your own stuff, to DIY work. It's worth it to make modifications like this to a vehicle, to improve your overlanding trips, your camping trips, to make your vehicle more capable. It's definitely worth it. If you've never done suspension before, that's something people are very scared of. It's not as scary as you think. I've probably swapped out coilovers and done leaf spring stuff, leaf spring stuff 5 to 8 times, and then coilover stuff 20, 30 times across cars and trucks. So, when I first started, I'd never taken anything apart on a vehicle before. I'd never done an oil change, but that was 15, 20 years ago. And now you learn and you get better and you're better. I'm good at brake jobs. I'm good at oil changes. I'm good at regular maintenance stuff. I'm good at, recognizing and diagnosing problems with the vehicle. And it all came from taking that leap and sort of forcing myself outside my comfort zone. Same with modifications. So don't be afraid. Get out there and do it. If you screw it up, try and do everything you can to minimize it, and you'll be fine. So again, hope that was helpful. If it was, click that like button if you're on YouTube. If you're on the podcast, leave a 5-star review and add it to your favorites. In the description down below will be links to all my social media channels, so wherever you want to come hang out, I'd love to have you. There's also a join button below this video on YouTube where you can click that and you can have early access to the podcast. You can have early access to all the other videos that I do, and it's just a passive way to support the channel. There's also a link to my Patreon group down there, whether you're on the podcast or YouTube, and that's a more active way to be involved with the channel, right? We have a 24/7 Discord. We talk about vehicles and gear and stuff all the time in there. We do a once-a-month Zoom call, and we'll do 1 or 2 trips a year to try and meet up in person and go out and hit some trails and camp and hang out. So if that sounds good, click on that Patreon link. There's also a link to my website down below where I've got funny overlanding camping theme patches and stickers. So tons of funny, things like don't burn your wiener and it's a hot dog, or F people, let's go overlanding. Like, there's funny patches and stickers like that. ATO patches and stickers too. So check that out if you want any of those. And then last but not least, there's the Newbie Overlanders Facebook group. Totally free to join. Over 18,500 people in there now, and it's growing every day. Probably about 350 people a week, which has been really exciting. It's just been growing like crazy, but it's different from the bigger groups. There's no bullying. There's a bunch of new people in there, and we're all trying to help each other enjoy our overlanding more. So if that sounds good to you, we'd love to have you, and you can go click there and join that. But again, thanks so much for watching. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.